Welcome, my friends, to the Sage of Quay Radio Hour, your home for free and critical thinking, and I'm your host, Mike Williams. Tonight, my friend and colleague Sofia Smallstorm returns to the show. Sofia offers her insights into how the extinction of the passenger pigeon is linked to genetically engineered foods. We also discuss how watersheds define our natural habitats. And so, without further ado, here's Sofia. Well, friends, we have a great show this afternoon for you, and we would have had a great show for you a couple of weeks ago, except Sofia and I recorded the show, and I had a software glitch, and it recorded my end of the audio, but it did not record Sofia. So we're actually having to do, well, I don't want to say we're doing the show over again. Maybe there'll be a segment of it that we'll do again, but this show is going to focus on Sofia's May 2018 newsletter, and we're going to talk about Martha and George. And so, Sofia, with that, maybe you can explain who Martha and George are.
First, you have to get the pronunciation right. Martha.
Oh my God, you're picking on my accent. Okay. I'll just call them M and G.
No, Mike. Martha was what you were saying.
I have a New York accent. I can't help myself.
This is just a little exercise. It's an exercise in your face.
Martha.
That's it.
Okay, that's the last time I'm going to say it.
Chocolate.
I don't say chocolate. I don't say chocolate or coffee, okay? I say chocolate and coffee. That I got right.
Just take that in stride. It's because you're a good friend.
Okay, so let's talk about the birds.
All right, so, North America used to be a continent which could boast the largest number of birds in a species worldwide, and that was the passenger pigeon. And they numbered 3 to 5 billion, and they were here not that long ago. And today, almost nobody has heard of them. I go up to people now that I read this, and I have to say that I had heard of pigeon pie as a dish. Had you?
I have. In fact, I think in some of the old movies and stuff like that, they would mention it, and I really didn't know what they were talking about.
So there used to be a lot of different bird species available at the markets. You could get partridge, pheasant, quail, even blue jays. And today, what do we have? Chicken and turkey.
Right.
But anyway, I am a vegan, and this part of it doesn't really interest me as a gastronomic delicacy. But I was stunned to hear how these pigeons were treated. They were called passenger pigeons from the French word passager, which means to pass by, to pass. And that's what they did. They just flew past, and they were so great in number that you could actually shake a stick within the flock, and they'd fall to the ground. You didn't have to be a good shot. You could just throw some buckshot up there and you nail a bunch of them. They would roost in trees, and there would be so many of them in a roosting, maybe 1 million even, or hundreds of thousands in a roosting. They'd take over entire forests, and they'd break all the branches of the trees. Americans sold them 6 for a penny in the markets of Chicago and New York. And the way people handled them when they fell to the ground, there were people who would literally crunch their heads off with their teeth.
Right, I read that, yep.
And snap their skulls with their thumb and forefinger. And then they were shipped. The telegraph and the railroad enabled let's just call it for now, the decline of the passenger pigeon, because word would be telegraphed as to where a roosting was taking place. And then hunters would jump on the trains and rush over there, shoot them all out of the sky or trees, and then they would be packed in barrels on ice. I'm still trying to figure out where exactly they got the ice. But anyway, the ice box was invented at that time. They would be packed in barrels, shipped off to the markets of the cities. Loads of them would be left on the ground. They were fed to the hogs. A lot went bad in transit. And in the end, there were none left.
I know, and we're talking about billions and billions of these birds.
Yep. And the last one was called Martha, and her husband or mate was called George. and they lived in a cage. This was in the early 1900s in the Cincinnati Zoo. George died in 1910 and Martha died in 1914, the last member of that entire species, 3 to 5 billion.
What caught my interest, Sophia, when I read the newsletter is, just the sheer magnitude of the amount of the birds. And, to kill that many creatures is like an all-out assault. And as you mentioned, they would break their heads or crack their heads with their teeth. It was very barbaric in a way. And, not even maybe in a way, it just was barbaric, the way they went about it. And, I'm not a vegan, but I don't eat meat. It bothered me a lot. To be honest with you, as I was reading through this, I was thinking to myself how really crude this whole thing was. And so by the time 1914 rolled around, billions and billions of birds were just gone. It's amazing.
Right. And, Americans never even dreamed that the passenger pigeon would go extinct. What did I say? Instinct? Oh,
maybe we should do a little. Hold on a second. Extinct. Yes.
Hurry up. Give me a swat. I deserve. Okay. So there is a term in economics, social economics, you could call it, called tragedy of the commons. And this was coined by Garrett Hardin in the 60s. He wrote an article titled The Tragedy of the Commons, and it was based on the lectures and pamphlet of William Forster Lloyd, who was a British economist in the 1800s. And this concept of tragedy of the commons is about the overuse of a common resource. And I thought of tragedy of the commons when I was reading about the passenger pigeons. The enormous quantity of pigeons, nobody dreamed that they'd ever be deprived of passenger pigeons for meals. People ate them for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, passenger pigeons. And tragedy of the commons, in the famous Hardin essay published in Science, was in the context of a social dilemma. And he gave the example, which originally was made by Lloyd, about grazing. So if you have a bunch of ranchers, let's call them, and they are sharing land for purposes of grazing their flocks, and every farmer has to observe a certain amount of, limit in how much his flock can graze on that land so that it's a shared resource. Hardin posited that there's always going to be somebody who overgrazes and says, so what, screw the rest of you. And that means that eventually others may try to retaliate, but the resource is going to be depleted and it's not going to be able to regenerate itself. And that's what happened with the pigeon. So soon, no one has anything.
It's interesting when I read that too, because I was thinking of human behavior in another way, right? So it just seems to me that humans, for the most part, well, at least some humans, have an inability to be able to regulate and to do things in moderation and to extend common courtesy, right? And that's why in society we wind up with laws and rules and policies and stuff like that, because we have that faction that will do whatever it is they want to go do and just ignore the rights or the common courtesy to others around them, so that they can share these resources, right? So that to make sure that they do the right thing. So it seems to me that, there's this pocket of humans and their behavior where they don't do the right thing, and it causes problems. And the problem that it really causes at the end of the day is that it starts to introduce regulation.
Mike, the passenger pigeon's disappearance was the birth of the environmental movement in America. And I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs from Harper's Magazine, which was where I read about the extinction of the pigeon. When the passenger pigeon disappeared from North America's skies, many could not believe it was really extinct and claimed that the birds had migrated to South America or Australia. Others suggested they had succumbed to some mysterious disease. Henry Ford thought they had drowned in the Pacific while flying to Asia. The extinction sparked a range of emotions. Rewards were offered for the discovery of survivors. Federal and state wildlife protection laws were passed. Too late for the passenger pigeon, but in time to save animals such as the American bison, another once plentiful species that had been pushed to the verge of extinction. On a psychological level, people struggled with the knowledge that extinction could happen so quickly and that we could be the cause.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing what humans can do. Going back to what I said before, Sophia, it's that whole process of self-governance, self-regulating, and being really connected to the environment, being connected back to nature. It just seems that they're oblivious to this balance that has to be in place in order for, nature to thrive. It seems like all bets are off many times. And I know we're going to get into this, but the whole thing with making money, greed, capitalism, whatever you want to call it, is a pretty big variable in why people behave the way they do.
Mike, I'll bring in now, instead of at the end. My newsletter brings us in at the end, and I couldn't develop it enough because I was at the end, and I give myself 6 pages single-spaced as a rule, unless it's a double issue. So I came up with this concept of the other AI. So we know of AI as artificial intelligence, but money is an AI as well. It's artificial incentive. And when that hit me, I thought, okay, I was actually stuck on the newsletter for a week thinking I got to finish this thing. But I knew there was something brewing and I didn't really know what it was. So I just let my unconscious or subconscious fool around with these concepts that I had written about. I came up with this AI, artificial incentive. Now let's not forget that, but let's go to the chicken. So I have deduced that what man forgot to do with the passenger pigeon, he did with the chicken.
So they had to replace the pigeon. So the chicken became the new pigeon, if you will. They started to, in order to do this, they had to pump the chickens full of antibiotics so that they would get this plumpness. This is not naturally how chickens, from what I gather from your newsletter, how they would grow and mature. So what we have is a species that has been tinkered with. This is what's winding up on people's tables. I mean, it calls into question too, and I know a lot of people are already going to know this, but in order for them to be able to make these chickens into what they need them to be in order to sell them as food and put on people's tables, everything they're putting into those chickens, humans are going to wind up consuming. I know this is not in the newsletter, Sophia, but I wanted to ask you about this. But one of the things that I had read was with chickens is there's a lot of estrogen that is being pumped into chickens. And of course, when you eat a chicken, that estrogen is there and it winds up in the human body. Of course, it can have complications. If you eat way too much of it, because you're getting that estrogen, especially if you're a guy, and things can get a little weird.
I think they use different agents for growth promotion. They use antibiotics for growth promotion. And somebody made a film a long time ago, a documentary from Britain called Supermarket Secrets. And they went to the supermarket and bought a chicken and then they centrifuged it. And it was 1/2 fat. Yeah. So I don't know if that was a bogus demonstration or not, but it could very well be that chickens not only contain antibiotics, but estrogens. But then they have been a pretty much, let's call it a genetically modified species since their origins as red jungle fowl in Asia, which were domesticated about 5,000 years ago. And the real chicken that people kept, now my deduction, again, I'm not educated in this, but I deduced that after the passenger pigeon disappeared, which was free-flying protein for Americans, they began to gobble up kitchen. Swat me! What's the matter with me? Chicken! I said, kitchen! Okay.
Yeah, you see what's happening is you made fun of me in the beginning, okay? So now it's like, what comes around goes around.
I admit it. I was mean, and this is my punishment.
Oh, no, you weren't.
Right,
It was
so
funny.
Chicken eggs. People kept chickens. Everybody had chickens. This was before people flocked to the cities. But when people were farming, lots of farms in America, everybody had chickens. Chickens ran around and they laid eggs and people ate the eggs. Some guy told me he had a few chickens just recently till he sold his house, and he said that they were guaranteed to lay 3 eggs a day. Just for him, a single person. So the chicken egg was a wonderful source of very inexpensive protein, and a lot could be done with it. It was very versatile. But the chickens themselves were scrawny, and they were muscular, and they weren't delicious. People ate the chickens, the hens, when the egg-laying days were over, and those chickens became soup in a pot, right?
Yeah.
So the roosters were grown a few weeks, and then they were called spring chickens, and they were sold in the markets. But the hens were kept for the eggs, and no chicken was this fat white butterball that we see today on our plates. Breast heavy, and that could be where the estrogen comes in, it builds this very plump body of a chicken. So what created the chicken market in America? This was very interesting to me, not directly to replace the passenger pigeon, because I think the egg did that. It was the influx of Jewish immigrants through Ellis Island in the 40s that was the real basis for the modern chicken market. And I read this in Dr. Mercola's newsletter of February, where he interviews and quotes Marin McKenna. She wrote the book, Big Chicken, The Incredible Story of How Antibiotics Created Modern Agriculture and Changed the Way the World Eats. So this population of immigrants with a different religion, which religion forbade them from eating pork. Sunday roast, pork roast was the Sunday meal. And the Jews who came to New York didn't eat that. So they wanted a nice meal for Sunday, which actually a lot of them started to observe Sunday as another Sabbath. Theirs is really Friday. But there's the Sunday Christian Sabbath. They wanted a nice meal for that to go along with the American or Christian tradition. And they picked chickens as their preferred source of protein for that meal. And so chicken became the meat of New York City. And with this immigrant population coming in at such a speedy rate and numbering so many, veggie farmers, as I call them in my newsletter, produce farmers, shifted into farming chicken. And then in the 60s, you got this chicken hot dogs, chicken sticks, chicken nuggets. And these are all scraps of the chicken that were kind of glued together with really weird other ingredients. Processed chicken you had as well. And so the chicken, let's just call it the chicken smorgasbord, became tremendous. And then they vilified red meat.
It's quite interesting as far as how this all came about. And I guess it was because, Sophia, what was the reasoning behind it? I mean, why did they have to find a replacement for the pigeon? Why did it have to be a chicken? I mean, was it because of the protein that was involved? That's what I was trying to figure out. Why did they have to find a replacement for the pigeon?
Well, because the pigeon was such an inexpensive food source, and there was nothing really to match it until they started big agri-farming chickens.
Yeah.
So I think people ate eggs in the interim, and then they started putting out these studies that cholesterol was bad for you. That was more in the 80s. But chicken was growing in the 60s, 70s. In the processed food market, was putting all this luscious Spam and luncheon meat and all these weird, almost unrecognizable meats on people's tables and in their sandwiches. And anyway, what I learned from McKenna, the author that Mercola interviews, is this idea of it's horrible, horrible, contract chicken farming. This is author Marin McKenna. The thing that is so extraordinary is the business structure that enables these giant farms. The farmers who raise chickens don't actually own the chickens. They own their land, usually, and the chicken houses and the manure that comes out of those houses. The company they grow for, the company to which they're contracted, they're called contract farmers. buys parent birds from a genetics company, hatches the chicks, takes the chicks to the farmers, brings the feed to the farmers, picks the birds up 6 weeks later, and takes them to a company-owned slaughtering plant, slaughters them, packages them, distributes them, and negotiates the wholesale contracts. Almost everything that's profit-making in the process of raising chickens belongs to the corporation. Almost everything difficult or economically perilous about chicken farming remains with the farmer.
Yeah, so we're really getting into this whole money making, which you said before, artificial incentive money being that, because as we go through your newsletter, we're going to see that a lot of people tried their hand at working these farms, right? Because they saw it as a way to make money.
Right. There were actually investors that enabled people who had good credit to get into farming and buy farming equipment, just as when refrigeration was introduced to fishing boats, you could get venture capitalists to back a giantly expensive commercial fishing boat, and you could become a commercial fisherman. That was in the 80s. So we're back to the 1930s. Modern agricultural methods, the heavy mechanical equipment. There were people who became what was known as tenant farmers or suitcase farmers. They didn't know much about farming, and they went to the Great Plains of America, invested in farming equipment, and rented land. And what happened? We got the Dust Bowl. And I was shocked to learn a few months ago when I was researching the Dust Bowl that this was the desiccation of Middle America. Part of it was a feature of ongoing drought. There were 7 years or so of drought, I believe. But the rest of it was due to the fact that these suitcase farmers used all this heavy machinery on the land, and they tore the land up, and they tore out the prairie grass and its long roots that held the topsoil in place. And then when the winds came, the winds simply blew away the topsoil. I mean, they blew that topsoil as far as the cities on the eastern seaboard. And so there was this outflux of population from Oklahoma in particular and other. If you look up the Dust Bowl, it's actually a vertical swath of land. It goes up high into the, latitudes of what we would consider Northern America, and it goes down into the Texas Panhandle. And it was all just toast. And people lost so much money. And that was because of mechanization, this artificial incentive in farming.
Yeah, so they didn't know how to take care of the land. Basically, it's almost like they strip mined it in a way. It got to the point where there was nothing left from a standpoint of soil to be able to continue the farming process. Is that basically what happened?
Right. There was, remember, it started with a drought. I'm going to just read. This is from Wikipedia on the Dust Bowl. After fairly favorable climatic conditions in the 1920s, with good rainfall and relatively moderate winters, which permitted increased settlement and cultivation in the Great Plains, the region entered an unusually dry era in the summer of 1930. During the next decade, the Northern Plains suffered 4 of their 7 driest calendar years since 1895. Kansas, 4 of its 12 driest, and the entire region south to West Texas lacked any above normal rainfall until record rains hit in 1941. When severe drought struck the Great Plains in the 1930s, it resulted in erosion and loss of topsoil because of farming practices at the time. The drought dried the topsoil, and over time it became friable, reduced to a powdery consistency in some places. Without the indigenous grasses in place, the high winds that occur on the plains picked up the topsoil and created the massive dust storms that marked the Dust Bowl period. The persistent dry weather caused crops to fail, leaving the plowed fields exposed to wind erosion. The fine soil of the Great Plains was easily eroded and carried eastward by strong continental winds. So, The Dust Bowl exodus was the largest migration in American history within a short period of time. Between 1930 and 1940, approximately 3.5 million people moved out of the Plains states. In just over a year, over 86,000 people migrated to California, more than during the 1849 gold rush.
Two things happened, right? They did not know really how to farm. They didn't have farming techniques. They were just trying to, I guess, make a buck, if you will. But then the drought hit to top it all off, and that was that. So then they left. They split.
And what saved the Great Plains? This will blow your mind.
What saved the Great Plains?
Soy and corn. It's really fascinating that we've got these two crops in America that are just going gangbusters. There are federal subsidies and whatnot. So we think of Henry Carr. Oops, I did it again. I must have drunk the wrong coffee today. I don't even drink
I'm
coffee.
leaving all of this in.
You're enjoying yourself, and you're allowed to. Okay, we think of Henry Ford as a car titan, right?
Yes.
But he was known as a bean's best friend. And which bean was that, Mike?
It was the soybean.
That's right. And you know, he was a progressive guy. So he fell prey to this rumor, this fear-mongering that we're going to run out of petroleum. And he decided he was going to investigate scientifically and support and fund research into using vegetables as their sugars as fuel, which would be ethanol, and then their fibers to make structural components for industry. So we've got soybeans and corn in a monoculture in America now. And they actually come from different parts of the world. Corn originates from Mexico, and then soy is from East Asia, and was primarily, I think, a table food. But the monoculture works in a very symbiotic way. Corn is nitrogen hungry, and soy replenishes soil nitrogen. And also soy and corn attract different insects and molds and bacteria. So these species never really get to take over the field. So they're switchable monocrops. And I find this absolutely fascinating.
Also, what I found fascinating, I did not know this, but in your newsletter it said that corn comes from primarily Mexico and soy from East Asia. I thought we were growing it here. Silly me. But just a little side note there, I did not know that.
Yeah. In fact, I was reading about another vine that came from God knows where. I think it comes from Japan, and it's absolutely choking out all of Britain and now all of America. I have to find that article. It was in Harper's. People who want to read brilliant stuff that's off the beaten track should subscribe to Harper's Magazine. It is my favorite magazine. This is not Harper's Bazaar, the fashion magazine. Harper's Magazine is totally worth a subscription. Look into it. But anyway, yeah, corn and soy come from other countries, and they've been brought to America, and they've actually replenished the farming of the Great Plains.
So Henry really invested himself in a lot of farming.
Yeah. So the results of the initial experimentation with soybeans, they have such usable oils, and then there's the high protein soy meal that they will yield after you extract the oil. So the soybean could be used to produce industrial lubricants, and the byproduct of that could be turned into plastics. So I'm going to be reading from the Harper's article of September 2017, Bringing in the Beans. The results of these experiments with the utilities of soy were so encouraging that in 1932, Ford approved $1 million in 1932 in new research funding, and that spring had 300 varieties of soybeans planted on 8,000 acres of his own farmland in rural Michigan. The next year, he expanded it to 12,000 acres, making him the single largest soybean grower in the U.S. That same year, he announced that he would buy any soybeans delivered to the Dearborn plant. To encourage production, he made 400 Fordson tractors available for free use to Michigan farmers and offered gas and diesel at a penny per gallon, less than a quarter of what it cost at the pump. Farmers put more than 35,000 acres of land into growing soybeans, and Ford bought their entire output as promised. It was a daring move, but good business. AI. Ford also put the full muscle of his publicity machine behind promoting soybeans. He hosted the National Convention of the American Soybean Association, promoted blending ethanol into gasoline, and gave a series of interviews telling one reporter that he envisioned a time when much of an automobile could be made from byproducts of agriculture. He even announced a plan to decentralize Ford production by opening a constellation of factories in rural areas to manufacture plastic parts made from local soybeans. Ford bragged that he used soybean oil in his paint and as a lubricant in his casting molds. When soybean meal was combined with formaldehyde, it could produce a thermoplastic resin, which was used to make distributor caps, gear shift knobs, and horn buttons. There is a bushel of soya beans in every Ford car, Fortune declared. He is as much interested in the soybean as he is in the V8. And that was what they called the soybean. They still call it that in England, soya.
S-O-Y-A.
S-O-Y-A, yeah. When the drought years of the 30s hit the plains, the soybean harvest continued to rise. And I'm not exactly sure why. Maybe it was because the soybean replenishes nitrogen that they kept growing them. And nitrogen is a very important ingredient of the soil richness. But anyway, soybean trading became so central to industry that was when the Chicago Board of Trade began to offer soybean futures, the 1930s. So by the end of the 30s, the soybean harvest was up to 75 million bushels a year. And that's when Time magazine declared Henry Ford a bean's best friend.
A lot of people didn't know that Henry Ford was a bean's best friend. Oh, they just thought he was in the automotive business. So then, Sophia, he died, right? And then things kind of changed for the soybean business after Henry passed away in 1947.
Right. The industrial interest in soybeans plummeted with Ford's death. In 1947, he had a cerebral hemorrhage. But what had happened was America had joined World War II. They had sent troops off to Europe, and they had discovered filet mignon, steaks, French wine, good eating. You know, the hot dog was now a thing for children. And the American palate changed after the war. So meat consumption increased, red meat. And the government began to subsidize corn and soybeans for livestock food. So the interest in raising livestock started to go up with this foreign experience that American men had overseas.
So we went from pigeons to chickens, soy, to red meat.
That ate soy. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. And then we get into really how difficult it is, I guess, to grow and process soy. That's something I didn't know either, that it's very particular with regard to how much moisture it has to have and so on. So it's not an easy process.
Right. So I was wondering how they succeeded in the 30s to grow so much soy if they didn't have the kind of, sophisticated techniques to keep track of things like moisture. But I think part of this has to do with the enormous glut of grain in America and the markets for soy. What happens when you have tremendous harvests, you have a lower price, right? So there we are with the artificial incentive of money. But yes, soybeans are tricky. And when you are growing soybeans for the modern market, because they're stored for so long, you have to deliver them at a certain moisture level.
Yeah.
It has to be 13% exactly. So above 14%, the grain elevator will charge for drying and then docks you for the shrinkage in the volume that you deliver. So if your soybeans are at 15% moisture, your entire load will be rejected. And, you know, soybeans, I found out, are what they call a short day plant. So they mature as the sunlight wanes. That would be in the late summer and early fall, and the evenings lengthen. So I'm just going to read this from Harper's. This is the soy article. So to make your best profit on soybeans, now again, this is about profit. This is not about simply the harvest. This is about edging out and doing better than the other people growing soy, because you've got the right qualities that the grain houses want, okay? To make your best profit on soybeans, you need a sunny day, but not too sunny, with a dry breeze, but not too dry, and you need that day to fall exactly when the plant has received the precise number of hours, yes, hours of sunlight from the moment you planted it months earlier. To make hitting such a tight window even remotely possible, seed companies like DuPont Pioneer have hybridized soybeans for nearly a century and genetically modified them in recent decades according to bands of latitude called maturity groups. They number these photoregions from 0 in the northern growing zones of Canada to 7 in the light-drenched flatlands of Florida. Nebraska is almost exactly divided between groups 2 and 3. So most farmers here plant both varieties of soy, the one that you would plant for group 2 and group 3, to spread out their risk. But some dairying farmers will guess as to what the weather holds for the growing season and plant more of one group, hoping for higher yields and higher returns. But when you get a high yield, that's too many beans in the market and the prices drop. So it's very, very difficult. This is, again, the complexity and the perilous risk for the farmer and the futures markets and all the people trading and, you know, commoditizing these forms of food. They make the money. The poor farmer is sitting there holding the bag when the weather does something unexpected and he doesn't get the right yield at the right time for the market. I mean, this really sucks because it's no longer driven by, is this a food? It's driven by how much of this is there and how much are people willing to buy? And then there's the exportation of soy to other countries and the political punishments that the United States has inflicted on other countries by holding back the soy export. I didn't even get into that.
You had a segment in here that had to do with this guy, this farmer Rick, who was trying to do organic, and I guess he folded his cards, right?
Right. It was easier to go with the flow of commodities and stick to GMO soy than it is to raise, as he had tried, grass-fed Black Angus beef and organic corn. This is what he was trying to do.
Yeah, it's really kind of sad. You know, it's I don't know, it's just the way things work in the world. I was taking a look also, Sophia, about types of foods that have soy in them. So meat alternatives like tofu, as an example. There's soy milk, soy nuts, soy sauce like teriyaki sauce, and so on. So it's something that's still very, very prevalent in our diets. Yes.
It's prevalent, and then of course it confers all this estrogen on males, and it's a xenoestrogen. Foreign estrogen. It's not human estrogen. It's an estrogenic plant. So a lot of children who were raised on soy milk have ended up with boobs if they were little boys. And here's the terrible thing. A woman spoke to me not too long ago, and I had done an interview on Red Ice, I think it was, one of my very early interviews about Bruce Jenner and his transition into the transgender thing. And actually, maybe it was before Bruce Jenner, because I was talking about this earlier even. But anyway, she said that she felt that she has a gender dysphoric, a son now. And I guess that means he's decided to be a girl. And she feels it's because of her heavy dietary soy consumption when she was pregnant.
It could be. You know, I was having this discussion with somebody the other day. You take a look at the male population as an example. I go to the gym, I go to my treadmill, I work out and stuff like that. And I see a lot of these young people come in, the young guys come in. Of course, there's guys that, they're in good shape, but there's a lot, well, outside the gym and inside the gym, right? Their bodies, they have feminine types of developments, the chest. And, what is that from? That's why I was talking before about the estrogen and the chicken and all that stuff. It just seems like the content of the food is a big, big problem. And there's a lot of people out there probably shaking their head in agreement. I don't know. If you're going to take this stuff in and you're going to eat whatever it is you're going to eat, you better be careful because it's going to have an impact on your health.
Yes, there's the food, and then there are the personal care products and all the plastics that we handle, the phthalates, in the personal care products. These are chemicals that are put in polymers to give them fluidity or rigidity. Like bisphenol A is an additive to polymer that gives it rigidity, stiffness. And then there are other additives, chemicals that make plastics nice and soft and pliable. And they're referred to as phthalates, Phthalates. And the phthalates are in shampoo, for God's sake. That's what makes your hair all glossy and shiny when you use this or that shampoo is the plastic in it, the plasticizers. They end up coating your hair. And, now they have these shiny cash register receipts, right?
Yes.
Well, those are feminizing plastics to men. So I was in a store where, I guess it was one of my bold moments, and I was at the checkout line, and I looked down the checkout line, and it was a bunch of male cashiers, and they were all bald or balding in their 30s, and they all had kind of like fleshy chests.
Man boobs.
Yeah. And I thought, my God, these guys are handling these receipts all day long, and they're getting so much of this xenoestrogen into their bodies, because the way that works is the molecule of, for instance, bisphenol A, BPA, it is shaped just like estrogen. Not exactly, but enough for the body to be fooled by it. So when the body gets a molecule that is a lot like estrogen in shape, when the cell receptors lock in or lock onto that, then the testosterone production drops because it's like a scale. It's give or take. So when there's a lot of estrogen, the testosterone stops. When there's not so much estrogen, the testosterone is raised. So this is why I think men are being feminized by these plastics, along with, as you mentioned, the foods. And the feminization of men lowers the resistance level of society in general to the programs and projects that we are all being, we're victims of these experimentations.
I'm glad you mentioned BPA because I was going to ask you about that. So I was looking up on the website here, Sofia, while you were explaining that. But, it says, of course, the FDA says that BPA is safe. And at the very low levels that it occurs in some foods, it's okay. But on the other hand, then they'll turn around and say that the FDA, this is coming from this website, it's the Mayo Clinic. So they'll say it's okay, and then they'll turn around and say, however, we're continuing to review BPA, including supporting ongoing research, which means, in my view, they know it's a problem. So on the Mayo Clinic website, they're saying, cut back on cans, reduce your use of canned foods since most cans are lined with BPA-containing resin. Avoid heat, meaning microwaving polycarbonate plastics or putting them in the dishwasher because the plastics may break down over time and allow BPA to leach into the foods. And they are recommending that you use glass, porcelain, or stainless steel containers for hot foods and liquids instead of plastic containers. So it's really interesting to me that on one hand they're saying, yeah, it's not a problem, don't worry about it. However, we are watching it still, and just in case you are concerned about it, here's a couple of tips. I don't know. Seems like that they're trying to cover both ends of the stick there.
Yeah, and BPA is just one of them, and now you can get bottles that are plastic that say BPA free, but there's bisphenol B, and there's bisphenol C, and there's other forms of bisphenols, and they're not good for you either. So because it says BPA free doesn't mean that it's safe, right? So the thicker the plastic in general, the better. I believe this crinkly plastic for water, especially when you have a water bottle in your car and it heats up and it's made of that crappy crinkly plastic. It just gives me the heebie-jeebies to see guys drinking from those anyway. Because I'm so fearful of their boob rate of growth. But anyway, Mike, I'm watching you. You're a little bit stumped as to my line of thinking here.
No, I'm listening. I'm not stumped at all. I'm just, as you're speaking, it's all over the place. I know we're getting into a man boob discussion, folks, but I didn't mean to get there. But I mean, we have to take a look at what these products are doing to people. I go back when I was a kid. I mean, there wasn't guys walking around with man boobs. I'm sorry, they weren't. And today it's very, very prominent. Anyway, I guess I'll stop talking about man boobs now. We could talk about something else.
Well, we're changing as a species or genus. We're changing, and we are generationally becoming different. It's a little bit sad, but the successive generations aren't going to be thinking that it's sad. They're going to enjoy their man boobs and embrace them. I mean, we're going to start seeing ads on TV and support groups for that, right?
Yeah. Men will start wearing bras, fashionable to walk around with.
Well, it might go the other way. If men can show their boobs, women will as well. So why have any covering at all?
Oh, that's a good idea. I haven't thought of that. Okay, it's okay then.
Or maybe it'll be restricted to size. A certain size, you don't have to cover yourself up.
Yeah, I don't know. It just, I don't know. I'm getting on the whole like fitness thing here. You just take a look around and just in general, people are just not healthy. They are not healthy. Of course, there are people who are, but there's a big piece of the population that they're not healthy.
The butt crack, that is what gets me. Because I see these families in California, and I don't know if this occurs in other states, but you'll see the father, he won't be very old, and he'll be walking in shorts with his feet pointing out in his flip-flops. You know that foot plant pattern that point out?
Yeah,
and he'll have
a duck.
He'll have butt crack showing. And then he's followed by a couple of little boys, and they're dressed the same, and they have flip-flops, and their feet are pointing out, and they have the exact same gait, and they have butt crack showing.
Yeah. Oh, this is really giving me I'm going to have a nightmare tonight. No, I know exactly what you're talking about. And what gets me is that people they just seem to be oblivious to it. I don't know. I don't know. There's a whole mindset, I think, that is evolving. Actually, and I shouldn't generalize like that because, of course, there are people who are very much focused on their health and their fitness, but I think that's a minority. The vast majority of the people are not very focused on their health, whether it be physical or even their emotional or mental health. Anyway.
Well, Mike, I have to say in their defense that in the old days, you didn't have to do much about your health. It was kind of part of the let's just say that the benefits of being healthy were conferred by the way you lived your life. People worked harder in terms of farming, physically harder. And now in this sedentary world with all these dangers, I mean, the world we live in is fraught with perils. And unless you're educated as to what those perils are and you can navigate your way around and through some of them, you're going to be an unhealthy specimen because it requires education and a certain level of intelligence to deal with preserving your health. Whereas before we didn't have to have that level of intelligence and focus and attention and all those personal protocols that we have today.
There was a lot more outdoor activity. I'm going back, Sofia, from when I was a kid. I remember my dad working outside, on the weekends. There would be a lot of yard work he would do, mowing the lawn, doing stuff like that. And as kids, we were always outside doing something. We were running around, playing with our other friends, playing softball, playing football, basketball, whatever it may be, on our bikes. We were always on our bikes, riding wherever. We would go for the day. Parents, they didn't worry, just come home for dinner, and everything was okay. So you're absolutely right. I mean, there was so much more movement, and people weren't staring at their phones or staring at their computers, or the adults, for the most part, they had work. A lot of, I guess, back in those days, a lot of the guys, many times during my generation, the moms stayed at home, or maybe they did a little side job or whatever, but the fathers were the breadwinners, and a lot of them were doing, work where they were working outside. There was a lot more manual aspects of their activity at work.
And there was housework, and we didn't have automation of chores. I mean, now we hire maids. I don't have a maid, but I know lots of people who just don't do their own cleaning, and they just hire a maid once every 2 months even to do it for them. But really, what I want to get into now is the idea of the regions that we live in, the watershed. Can we get into that a little bit?
Yeah, let's talk about the watershed. That's the show, folks, that I blew it, or my software program blew it.
No, you owe me a miracle, because I wasted so many of my wise words on that flub.
You're never going to let me forget this, but okay.
My parents said I had a memory like an elephant.
You do.
I do. That's why I can write these.
I know you do.
That's the only reason. Okay. All right. So, Mike, I had heard this term watershed, but I didn't really know what it was. And I found out from this guy I met in January. He used to be a Wall Street banker, if you can believe it. And he got really carried away with the watershed. And watersheds, they actually start at these things that we've all heard this term too, the continental divide, right?
Right.
You've heard that?
Yes.
And the continental divides are the highest ridges on every continent. So they are the mountains that are the highest. And we're now talking about the secondary water flow, the water cycle on the earth. There's something called primary water, which you can look up, which is also, it's another topic that I know almost nothing about, never heard of it until recently, and it blows my mind. But anyway, this is the secondary water cycle, which would have to do with rain coming down or snow and then evaporation of water going up. So where the highest points are, the water that hits the earth in rain or snow, it is either going to flow inland or out toward the ocean. So we have endorheic and exorheic regions of the world. So endorheic means inside. So those are the direction of the drainage that goes into inland seas. It all winds up in what's called a catch basin. So the inland seas, like the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, and lakes like the Great Lakes, they are the catch basins for endorheic shedding of water. And then you have the oceans as the catch basins, or rather the lagoons, and those are the true basins, and then it all flows into the ocean for the exorheic regions. So as you look at any place on the earth, you will see that it is within some kind of watershed where water is shedding down into a creek or a river, and that's where people used to build. They built around and near water because water supported life. It was so vital to life. So as I learned this concept of watershed, I deduced completely correctly that I live on a creek shed. You have river sheds, you have creek sheds, and my creek, I don't own it, is called the Escondido Creek, and I live in something that the hydrology maps of my region vow as the Escondido Creek watershed. And I thought this was remarkable. The Escondido Creek watershed has a catch basin, which is the San Elijo Lagoon. I drive by it every day. And it is fed upstream by Lake Walford, which I believe is partly a man-made diversion that comes from the San Luis Rey watershed, which is the watershed to our north, to the north of me. And it's the bigger shed. So my little shed, Escondido Creek shed, is part of the San Luis Rey watershed. I'm believing this and figuring it out on my own because I called the County of San Diego, the hydrology department, and they couldn't even tell me the answer. They didn't know what shed I was part of. And the shed to the south is the San Dieguito River shed. So you can just look at your watershed map of your state. New Jersey, for instance, is replete with watersheds. And this was where we get the names, people, such and such run, such and such Muddy Run, Birch Creek, Oyster Creek, Dennis Creek, Scotland Run. These are all places I believe they're in New Jersey because this was in my newsletter and I was looking at the New Jersey watersheds, which are all fed by all these creeks and rivers. And sometimes they're called kills. There's a town in New York, Fishkill, and
yes.
People were pissed off because they thought it meant killing fish. Well, kill in Dutch means stream. So there's a lot of Peekskill in Westchester County is a stream. So the important thing about watersheds, the mind-blowing thing, I shouldn't just say important, is that the watershed is our real boundary system. Because wherever the water drains is a little ecoregion. It's a bioregion, and it has its own biome. And the sheds are different from one another. There are different species and different kinds of plants that live in each watershed. And animals recognize watersheds. Animals don't recognize, where's the state of Texas ends and the state of New Mexico begins, and they don't care. But animals will go from one shed to another seasonally. They'll migrate because life is supported better in the warmer shed where they go for the winter. So these sheds, I realize, are not only are they distinct bioregions, they're naturally autonomous, and they are sanctuaries. And if you look at a map, oh my gosh, I've sent this to you, and please put it at some point in the YouTube that you make of this show, of the European watersheds instead of the countries. It's incredible. You want to pull that up?
Yeah, let me take a look at it. Hold on.
Do you have it still? I can put it in the chat.
You put it in the chat. I was just looking up the one where I live. It's the Neuse River Basin.
Yeah, you had looked this up before.
Yep, the Neuse River Basin. That's where mine is, in Raleigh.
So that's the name of your watershed. That's your catch basin.
Yes.
And I'm showing you now the European watersheds.
Yep. I'll put this in the show. Yep.
I mean, look at them. Let's comment on some of them.
I mean, they're all over the place.
So you can see, for instance, let's look at France. We're familiar with the Seine. It's the river that runs through Paris. The Loire is another river. Then there's the Rhone River. There's the Garonne River in South France. And these are also regions of France. The Loire Valley, for instance, I've heard of. But these are sheds unto themselves. They are the watersheds of France. And then in Germany, you have a giant shed called the Rhine. There's another shed called the Elbe. And you have the Weser, the River Weser from Hamelin Towns in Brunswick by the something of Hanover City. The River Weser, deep and wide, washes its walls on the southern side, a pleasanter spot you never spied. That's Pied Piper of Hamelin. Okay, so you have the Maas shed. You have the Oder shed, the Donau. This is now southern Central Europe.
Yeah.
And these are the real boundaries of Europe. On the boundary itself, that's the high point, and then it flows into the low points.
So these are our natural boundaries, right, versus the artificial constructs we have called countries and stuff like that. This, if they really left it to nature, this is what it would look like.
Right, and these are all different bioregions. So The idea being that you have lots of different species in a shed. And if you had consciousness of the shed you lived in, you would be proud of it. People would say, where do you live? And instead of saying, well, I live in Encinitas, I would say, I live in the Escondido Creek shed. And people who go to Portland, Oregon might be welcomed by a sign that says, you are now in the Columbia River watershed.
Yeah.
Rather than this is Portland, Oregon, right?
Right. So if you're driving, instead of Raleigh, it would be you're in the Neuse River Basin.
That's right. And now what really kind of amazed me was I started looking at the Long Island Sound watershed. It's 10 million acres. And it starts east of Quebec in Canada, because this is the dribble of the water. It runs south on either side of the Connecticut River, because it runs into that river.
Mm-hmm.
And then it runs through Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and then Connecticut, because the Connecticut River starts north of Connecticut, and it picks up two smaller watersheds, the Housatonic River and the Thames, which is in Rhode Island. And then it grabs the drainage basins of the mainland coast, Westchester County, and Long Island. So the Long Island Sound is the catch basin for 10 million acres of land. And it's dying. And why is it dying? Because of the crap that people are putting on their land, which is partly industrial, partly farming, chemicals and fertilizers, and partly it's stuff like what you use on your lawn.
Yep, it's all the chemicals used on lawns and whatever people are dumping into the ground or dumping into the water, right?
Right. So the residents of Vermont and Canada are contributing to what's in Long Island Sound. They have a responsibility to keep the Long Island Sound healthy by what they put in their water and what they use on their land. And that's where, people have a disconnect. They think, I live in Canada, why should I care about the Long Island Sound? And the Sound is a disgusting basin now. It is bright green. When I used to swim in the Long Island Sound, I had a friend with a little boat, and we'd go out, and we'd have to now this was 1980s, we'd have to stand and wait for streams of garbage to pass us before we could dive in. And we thought that was gross.
Yeah, well, I spent a lot of time up there too, Sofia, because I'm originally from Long Island. So I never thought the Long Island Sound when I was growing up, again, going into the 1980s and stuff like that, 70s and 80s, was very clean.
You would think that in deep water, it's clean. And it isn't.
I know it's not, right.
And actually my friend lost his anchor and he decided he was going to dive for it. And I had to direct this dive a little bit. And he kept going down and coming up and going, you're not going to believe what I'm seeing. I'm seeing so many automobile tires. It's disgusting. This is the floor of the Long Island Sound. But anyway, that was back in the 80s. So now we've got all this erosion even from land development. I mean, there's so many factors, chemical spills. And we've got, of course, the GMOs, fracking, chemtrails. So the guy I met has put up a website called the SalishSea.org website. And the Salish Sea was actually a term, SALISH, that was created in 1988 by a marine biologist called Bert Weber. And he wanted to raise awareness about caring for that ecosystem. So the Salish Sea Shed it encompasses Canada, Vancouver. I'm going to look at the picture of it here and I'm going to put it in the chat for you. But it is immense as well and very diverse. I mean, it has 17 different Indian tribes in it or something like that, and all these different ethnicities now, and people from China have come to Vancouver, India, and these people are all living in the Salish Sea Shed, and they should know about it. I mean, Seattle is in the Salish Sea watershed, Olympia, Washington, Bellingham, Washington, Vancouver in Canada, and then you've got the Straits of Georgia, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, the Puget Sound, all these islands, the San Juan Islands, the Orcas, And this is from where the Navy, captured and kidnapped all these whales, killer whales, and dolphins, and transported them to places like SeaWorld. And so what this guy is doing is he's trying to get the return of these wonderful animals who live in torture for so many years back to their home in the Salish Sea. And what is interesting about the watershed topic is that it is a very feel-good kind of subject to introduce to mainstreamers. And they all love it. They love knowing that they live in a shed. Whether this is going to change the way we map the world, I don't know. And whether it's going to dovetail right hand in hand with Agenda 21, their whole ecology, environmental restraints and directives. But sheds are sanctuaries, and we've got to understand that unless we treat our land properly, we're going to affect species, and we're one of the species that lives in those land areas that have to do with what kind of water flows into them. So the guy I'm not going to use his name because he doesn't want me to, who started this website, salishsea.org, he calls it a bioregional marine sanctuary, the Salish Sea. And he wants the people of the Salish Sea bioregion to become aware of the marine sanctuary's web of life, water quality, and quality of life for all life. So it's through the introduction of the watershed platform and awareness that he can bring up artificial weather and geoengineering, GMOs, fracking, chemtrails. I mean, he said, I've tried to tell people about chemtrails and they don't want to hear about it. But when I tell them about the watershed they live in, they're all gaga and they love it. And when you tell them that there's being weather modification over these sheds and that affects life in the shed, then they're more open to the idea.
So that's interesting that they are more interested in this, or the watersheds catch their interest, I should say, more than talking about geoengineering, which I find kind of interesting because geoengineering, Sophia, as you know, is like it's more obvious. You can actually look at the sky and see the spraying. This is more, this is a little more intangible because you really have to look at a map and understand how the watershed, what it looks like and how it's defined. I find that very interesting.
Well, Mike, I think it has to do with the fact that people have been propagandized. It's cool to be concerned with the environment, right? And people want a T-shirt and a tote bag to save this dolphin or whale or otter or beaver or bird. Passenger pigeon. They should have tote bags for the passenger pigeon, which, poor thing, doesn't even have a place here anymore.
No.
But the watershed idea is a way to introduce in this feel-good way that people have become accustomed to, the idea that they're living in a world that's being altered. And it's not us. I mean, we contribute to the watershed quality by what we choose to, wash our clothes with versus, and how we fertilize our lawn and whatnot. But the government, the powers that be, are radically affecting life in the watershed. So he started this we the people of the Salish Sea marine sanctuary. We forbid fracking. We forbid geoengineering. We forbid artificial weather. And he's hoping that will catch on. I don't have high hopes, but.
Yeah, I don't have high hopes either. I mean, look, it's a worthy undertaking nonetheless, And the reason why I sound like pessimistic about it, I don't want to sound like a Debbie Downer, but I just know how people react to these things. Once they get the T-shirt and the tote bag, it's off to wherever, to go do more shopping, whatever it may be. It's for most people, they treat it like a fad. It's like when people talk about geoengineering, their idea of being an activist or being concerned is taking pictures of aerosol spraying and putting it up on Facebook, and that's it. So I don't want to pick on anybody, but it's just makes you scratch your head.
No, you're right, Mike. I mean, they want that tote bag and that T-shirt and the calendar, and then they think they've done their part.
Yeah.
So the fact, though, that our real borders have to do with catch basins and the high line and how water descends, and that creates a habitat that supports certain species and not others. Every one of these is different. And I'm happy to know that I figured out that I live in a creek shed. And that's my boundaries to that shed. I could find them on a map, but they would be the ridge lines over which the water flows in one direction or the other. And those are the borders.
How did you read an article on this? I mean, how did you even stumble upon this?
I told you I met this guy, and he showed me a map of the Salish Sea watershed, and he wouldn't stop talking about it for 3 hours.
Okay, so that was the origin of you looking into it? It wasn't anything before that? Like you didn't read an article in Harper's?
No. I'll just stumble into people. And this guy, he's very bright, and he's very active. He's meeting with all these different Indian tribes. The Indian tribes are loving this idea.
Yeah.
That they live in a shed and it needs to be protected.
So, Sophia, I know I'm going off into left field a little bit on you, but I'm just curious, like your train of thought when you go through this, because this has always interested me whenever we do a show. I've always been intrigued by what makes you motivated to pick up on an idea and then to do more research on it and pursue it. Because most people, if they had run into this gentleman and talked about the watershed, they would go, yes, it's very interesting. But then, that would be about it. They would go about their day and they wouldn't focus on it anymore. But what caught your attention on this? What made you do more research on this?
When I figured out that I lived on a creek shed. I mean, when somebody tells me about such and such, and I go, that's very interesting. And even if it is, and it's inspiring, and the person is enthralling, and I listen for 3 hours as I did with this guy, then I go home and I think, well, what watershed do I live in? And all I have to do is look out the window and I see the Escondido Creek and I go, well, could I live on a creek shed? Is that what it's called? And then I start Googling watersheds of San Diego County, and there it is, the Escondido Creek Shed. It's real. I even figured out the right name. And I see how big it is, and I want to know, well, it's a small shed, so what is it a part of? I find out that the lagoon is the catch basin, which, by the way, they are dredging because they want to make more off-ramps for the Interstate 5, and they've dredged up all this sand from the lagoon bottom. They call it, you'll laugh, nutrients. They built this huge, ugly pipe, miles long. The thing was literally like almost 2 feet wide. And they put this pipe on Cardiff Beach, and they pumped sand with nutrients from the bottom of the lagoon, which had collected there for God knows how long, because it's a catch basin. They pumped this sand onto the beach, and they were boasting about how great it would be, 300 feet of white sand, and it did. It dried up, and then they put more of it on South Solana Beach, which is a different watershed. So they actually took material from one shed and moved it to another shed. And I was told that this was 80% water from the lagoon and 20% sand, and all these nutrients, which are, forms of, small life. I forget what they're called, but they're the equivalent of, I think they're called flagellates or something like that, plankton, and that's sea related, but there's a word for it in freshwater, and I can't remember, and a lagoon is a mixture. But anyway, the nutrient content has drawn all kinds of little bait fish to our shores in the last few months. And those little bait fish are followed by bigger fish, and they'll be followed by thresher sharks and whatnot. So there's a new kind of activity off our shoreline for these last few months, because all of those small life forms, which are food for bigger life forms, have attracted attention on the shoreline. So I'm just saying, you can't just dump stuff from one container into another on the earth, as we know, but it's done all the time, right?
Yeah.
And this dredging of the lagoon, well, fortunately, they had the bright idea. I don't know how many millions of dollars it cost. I think it cost like $50 million to do this. to give us a little bit of sand on a few beaches. Can you believe this? And they were working 24-hour shifts, 24-hour shifts all night and all day to get this done by the time summer started. And it is actually done.
All of this just really just solidifies the fact that just about everything is some artificial construct, isn't it? Everything has artificial boundaries. Is there anything organic or real anymore that we operate within in this life?
It's pretty artificial now, Mike. And, I have to say, just to explain a little more in answer to your question. So I saw in front of my eyes the transport of one shed, the bottom of a shed, the catch basin, to another place, which could very well be another shed. And in my opinion, it is another shed. And then I had a fisherman telling me about all the different, the krill that was coming to eat those subforms. I don't know what they're called. Why am I not thinking of the word?
Well, just take a moment and look it up.
No, it would take me forever to find it. There's a dinoflagellates and phytoplankton, and these are the kinds of things that's the term for the ocean. And then I don't know if it's a different term for freshwater, but he had a word that I recognize and I don't use it much. Doesn't matter. Whatever it is, it's on the level of the smallest forms of food, and they come. And then nutrients. I mean, God, there could be tons of nitrogen at the bottom of that lagoon, which was transported and dumped on the beach and it's become part of the ocean, right?
Yeah.
So that will create an algae imbalance or overbalance or something, overgrowth. So everything is artificial. Everything.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I don't know. All we can do is to do shows like this to bring awareness and put the information out, and hopefully people grab onto it and they start to understand more about the quote unquote the reality that we live in, which is I don't even know. Don't even like calling it a reality. It's something. It's an experience or whatever. I don't know what to call it. But everything is just so out of skew. We've fallen away from the natural order, the way things are supposed to be organically, fake boundaries and, it's just unbelievable. It really is. So I hope that the audience is getting a lot out of this. I mean, even going back to the first segment of the show, the fact that all of those pigeons, billions of them were wiped out, just wiped out, and then how everything became all about genetics, genetically engineering, like the chickens as an example, right? And now we're talking about artificial boundaries that we abide by or that we're supposed to abide by, called states or towns or municipalities, versus the watersheds, which is really our real habitat, if you will, right?
Right. Those are our eco-distinct regions that we live in, that we should be aware of and that we should be protecting and proud of being in. And they all have their own characteristics. So I know what it is. Cyanobacteria, diatoms. That was the word he used.
Oh, how did you forget that?
Oh, I don't use them much. Use those words much. But all of this plankton is technically one of the trophic groups of low food chain animals. It's the big group. But then there's phytoplankton, zooplankton, bacterioplankton, and mycoplankton. And he used that word diatoms. So, diatomaceous earth, that's probably why I paid attention to it. Have you heard of that?
No, you use words and you know things that I don't know.
Well, a lot of people in the alternative movement eat diatomaceous earth, which is also called fossil shell flour, and it comes from seabeds, and it's the shells of crustaceans that were called diatoms, and it's considered good, a filter for the digestive system. It's a silica in very, very fine form. Diatomaceous earth, because it comes from the skeletons of these animals that lived a long time ago. So that's probably why I paid attention to it. But I mean, here's an example of something you can do very easily. I sell on my website, avatarproducts.com, my store, Himalayan soap berries and the Himalayan soap berry liquid. So instead of putting detergent in your wash, you can put 6 to 8 little berries in a bag, and the little mesh bag comes, and you just plop that in your washer along with your wash, and that cleans your clothes. That's a natural surfactant that extracts the soil and odors out of your clothes, and your clothes will be so clean and fresh. And if you don't want to use berries, the nuts themselves, which can be reused up to 8 times, you can just do a little squirt of the liquid extract, and your clothes feel so soft. I mean, Mike, I have to tell you, I have these towels from literally when I first became independent and wasn't living at my parents' house. And I gave up on them because they became hard and kind of crusty, and I used them to dry wool sweaters. And then when I moved to California, I didn't have that use anymore. So I was thinking, I'll use them for rags or painting. But I have revived all of them with Himalayan soap berries. Now they're so soft. They work as absorbent towels. There's nothing wrong with them.
How old are these towels? We're like 50 years old.
30, 40, 50. They're almost 40 years old, and they're fine.
All right. As long as they're fine now. They went from being stiff and being used as rags to fine linen now.
Jeans are so stiff, unless you put them in the dryer and then they shrink. So all these clothes, sometimes even T-shirts, because when you use detergent, it leaves residue. And plus it has tons of chemicals, and it messes up all of the groundwater and the drainage water. So if you use Himalayan soap berries, they're 100% botanical. And it's the coolest thing. It's quick and easy. You just throw this little bag into the washer, and if you do a certain number of loads over a certain period of time, you just put a few more berries into the bag, and you can throw the old ones right on the ground outside because they are botanical. They're ecological products. Biodegradable, exactly. And it's amazing to be doing things like this that nobody does. I mean, when you go in those dishwashing soap and dish detergent and laundry detergent aisle in the supermarket, I have to actually blink. My eyes start to tear when I'm in that aisle, and the smell is awful.
Yeah, the laundry detergent aisle does that to me. It's overbearing. I wanted to ask you, so what about like washing your dishes? Is there some kind of organic cleaner you can use in your dishwasher?
I don't do dishwasher, but I use a combination of Miracle 2 liquid. I thin it out and I put in the Himalayan soap berry dishwashing liquid, which I don't carry in my store, but you can find it online, or I can start carrying it if people are interested. But I have found that a combination of those two, you put it in a separate bottle and you dilute it, add some water. It's the best cleaning agent for doing dishes. It just cuts through the grease, and I never have much grease anyway. I'm just so perfect. It's so amazing. All right, I'll shut up.
No, you're doing great. Now, do we have more to talk about watersheds, or did you want to talk a little bit more about some of your products?
I would say let's focus on Himalayan soap berries. People should give those a shot. And let me just give you a tip. If you have one of these fancy front-loading machines that conserves on water and uses a very small amount of water, you should not use the berries themselves. You should use the liquid concentrate. And you only have to use a very little amount. And it's really like less than a teaspoon. And if you have a top-loading washer, that will agitate more freely and allow more water to come in. You can use the soap berries. But you've got to try these soap berries. They're so cool. And, here's the thing. They don't require rinsing. So when you actually wash with Himalayan soap berries, the berries themselves, in normal washers, you get a wash cycle and a rinse cycle, and sometimes 2 rinse cycles, because detergent is so slimy, it's hard to get out of clothes. But the soap nuts will do a second wash. So you're actually washing your clothes 2 times with a regular wash. So they come out actually very clean.
Very good. So we will put a link in the show to your store, and specifically to the soap berries.
Yeah, the Himalayan soap berries. I would definitely encourage people to try them. And if you haven't tried Miracle 2, actually, I'm going to try to invent my own detergent, soapy detergent, just for the hell of it, because I'm constantly fiddling around with things. And I'm going to use some Miracle 2 in it, maybe some borax, and just see how that feels on wash. But that will require a rinse cycle. Miracle 2 is like a soap, but you have to try Miracle 2 if you've never tried it. Have you tried it, Mike?
No.
Oh, my God. If you have longer hair, I can see you don't, but if you use conventional shampoo, even expensive natural products, your hair stays clean for a certain amount of time, and then it starts feeling gunky, and you've got to wash your hair. Well, Miracle 2 will pretty much double that time period. You can get away with washing your hair every 4 days instead of every 2 days, and it just cleans so well. And the woman who turned me on to it, she is actually a distributor of Miracle 2, and she said she washes her car with it. And I just responded like she was crazy. I said, why? And she said, because it gets everything so clean. And when I started using it, I realized that's right. Everything has this incredibly clean feel. And it's not harsh. You can use it on the most sensitive scalp, and it's great for your skin.
Now, are you selling it in your store?
Yeah, I just sell the liquid soap, but I use the moisturizer. You can find some of these other things online.
I just looked it up. I'll have to pick some up from your site. After the show, I'll place an order.
Thank you. You'll love it. Even people brush their teeth with it.
Yeah. Interesting. I don't know why I've never heard of it. Okay.
Oh, it's very popular. Miracle 2. All right. Well, Mike, have we been on long enough?
We have, Sophia. And, thank you so much for coming back on the show. And again, sorry about the last show.
Don't worry. I gave you sufficient grief, and then I got my own grief, stumbling and bumbling the way that I did.
You did great. It was a great show. And I know the audience, they really enjoy the conversations and the information that you bring forth. So thank you so much again for coming on. And your newsletter is subscription-based. Maybe we should cover that with the audience a little bit. Yes.
If you want to receive the newsletter, Mike and I'm trying to prevent him from making me do shows on every single issue, because I ask for people to subscribe. And the subscription is a donation. It's a minimum of $50 per year, but you're always welcome to give more. Sometimes I get a little tip. And it goes by mail. So you can keep the issues in a binder, as many people apparently do. You can sit down quietly and read them. I don't like to send things like this by email, because the interruptions when you're on the computer, and the difficulty of really like cuddling up with something and reading comfortably you can't do it on a computer. So I send it in the mail. And I ask for foreign subscriptions, just a little bit more than 50, so that I can cover the foreign overseas postage. But I already know what I'm going to write the next issue on, but I just have no idea beyond that. So I just have a vague idea, and then I live with it for a while.
Well, the next show, we should just wing it, right? That's what you wrote in your last email to me.
Yeah.
We should just wing it. We should not do a show on any newsletters. We should just talk about whatever it is that you and I feel like talking about.
Yeah, we should do a show like that, Mike. That would be fun.
Yeah, we'll do that next. Whatever it is we want to talk about. There'll probably be a lot of editing. So, all right, Sophia, thank you so much again. You're a good friend. And we'll catch up maybe next month.
Thank you, Mike. Very best to you and to everybody listening. And I'm always grateful for some emails that I get from some people that just show, liking, that they like the interviews and they like the work. And I'll just go on and on and on until the world saves itself. How's that?
Yeah, that means you're going to be talking and writing a long time. And that concludes another Sage of Quay interview, and I hope you enjoyed the discussion as much as I did. Links to my guests' websites and social media are listed in the show notes below. And as always, I'd like to thank everyone for listening and visiting the blog. You can get to the blog by typing in sageofquayradio.blogspot.com, or simply head over to our hub website at sageofquay.com. Also, if you get a moment, please visit laboroflovemusic.com to listen to my album, Leaving Dystopia. And remember, live in truth, and always serve creation. It's really that simple. See everyone next week. Be safe, enjoy, and God bless.
Shepherd, you can be a